Welcome to Lab 8. Today in this lab, we are going to be talking about modern human variation. So we're going to talk a little bit about race. We're going to talk a little bit about, skin color, altitude, climate, and blood groups, and then lactose intolerance. And that was the last thing that we talk about for this chapter. But there's a lot to unpack in this lab, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is race. So, get this to work. Race. So, since early naturalists began classifying biological organisms centuries ago, various scientists have attempted to subdivide the human species into distinct racial categories. So, it's almost like once we started to divide the species, we just wanted to hyper do this, like really go in and just divide everything and classify everything and organize everything into its neat little category, right? But again, it doesn't work that way with humans. So historically, this was done by bioanthropologists, especially through the use of various skeletal traits for racial affiliation. Much of this research was conducted by Europeans who created hierarchical schemes of human variation that suggested that they, the Europeans, were superior to other groups of people, the non-Europeans. Often, physical traits were linked with personality traits in racial classifications, such that different racial groups were linked with different levels of intelligence, propensities towards violence, and degrees of quote-unquote savagery. Governments and other ruling bodies often use these racial categories and the behavioral traits associated with them to then justify the subjugation or systematic extermination of certain groups. So essentially, governments said, well, these individuals are much more savage, or they're more propense to being violent, or whatever, or levels of intelligence, whatever they want to say, and they use that as a justification for them to go in and exterminate them or enslave them or whatever. Right? So that's our example, right? Many colonial powers used the classification research of anthropologists to justify their unfair treatment of colonized indigenous populations. The historical roots of racial categorization and racism form the basis for our misunderstanding of human biological variation. So today, anthropologists are trying to both better understand human variation and prevent the misuse of their research, right? Remember, their research was widely misused for a very long time. It is important to recognize, though, the history of the discipline and the complications surrounding racial categorization while simultaneously examining the nuances of human variation and significance, right? So I'm not going to say that this field was not used for harm in the past. It really was. But we also have to understand the nuances of human variation and the significance of it. So dividing people into distinct racial categories assumes that people from different groups are biologically distinct. Traditionally, right, these racial classifications were based on obvious physical characteristics, things like skin color, stature, and eye color. These traits were readily observable, and they seemed to vary between the populations. In recent years, though, we have been able to analyze underlying genetic data, which has presented us with a very different picture of human variation that directly challenges the notion of genetic basis for race, right? So race is not what we originally thought it was. So, comparisons of genetic information show that most of human variation is actually found within populations rather than between populations. So, the example here is in many traditional racial classifications, all people from Africa are treated as one population that is distinct from populations from other continents, right? So all these individuals at the bottom of the page are considered African, right? However, newly studied genetic data shows us that, and we can see based on the individuals here at the bottom, right, the greatest variation is actually found within this broad African population, right? The greater degree of within population variation makes sense in terms of the evolutionary history of our species, right? It makes sense because humans have inhabited Africa for the longest time. And if you have a group that has inhabited a region for a much, much longer time than anywhere else, right, they're going to have a lot more genetic variation, because each time you move outwards, right, remember the founder effect, each time you move outwards, you lose some of the original genetic variation, and so you decrease your variation. So therefore, the original population has the most genetic variation. Right. So first, it's important to note that humans are a very recent species, and they have not had enough time to accumulate a lot of biological changes, which makes them very genetically similar. Secondly, humans have a tendency towards mobility and interbreeding. So people are not as deterred by a mountain range and bodies of waters as other primates. Right? We move between environments and territories regularly and will often mate with people found in other areas. Therefore, the human population has not been subject to as much reproductive isolation as many other primate species. Humans have been undergoing gene flow regularly throughout their evolutionary history, and this has helped humans be more genetically similar to one another. Right? We have not had that much of genetic isolation to really then speciate and create this whole separate species of humans, right? We have not had that. So, while we have genetic differences, most are minor variations within populations, and it suggests that any differences we might see between populations are relatively superficial. These variations, right, have evolved recently, sometimes only within the last few thousand years, and they often reflect recent adaptations to particular environmental or cultural circumstances. So there is no biological basis for these large-scale classifications. However, our superficial variations can be used to better understand the nuances of our ancestry. We can apply our knowledge of evolutionary processes to understand patterns of variations that reflect population movement, so the founder effect, interbreeding, gene flow, and adaptation, which is natural selection. This then allows us to move beyond that rigid structure of racial categorization that we had previously to a more fluid understanding of evolutionary history and ancestry. So while genetics suggests that there is no biological basis for distinct racial categories, this does not mean that racial categories lack cultural significance. So I want to make that part very, very, very clear, right? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. One of the things that we learn about when we talk about human variation, and you take a human variation class or even this physical anthrop class, one of the things that most anthropologists say is there is no biological basis for human variation, right? Race is not biologically, there's no biological proof for race, right? And while that's true, right, that doesn't mean it's not important, right? We can't just say it does not exist and therefore we don't talk about it. It has important cultural significance, and that's something that does then affect us biologically, right? Because if we think about it, right, say, culturally, the cultural significance of certain individuals, certain groups of individuals having less access to adequate food, healthy food, and lack of access to adequate health care, right? Biologically, it is going to affect them because they're not going to have the nutritional requirements they need. They're going to have diseases emerge, right? Because of that, and then they don't have adequate health care, right? Then it leads to, higher mortality rates and younger mortality rates among those individuals. And so, yes, the social construct of race is a cultural construct. Yes, it's something that we created, but it does, and it's not biologically, like in genetics, it's not biologically there. There's no gene for, say, Asian versus African versus European, in Native American, right? There's no gene for that, right? But it does affect us biologically when you think about it in those ways. So it's just a little tangent, right? Just want to make sure, right? Genetics suggests that there is no biological basis for distinct racial categories, but it does not mean that it doesn't affect us, right? Because it does have a cultural significance. Therefore, it can affect us biologically. All right. If I confused you by saying all of that, it's okay. Just email me and we can talk about it. Or just know if there's no biological basis, but it's culturally significant. Right? So race. So many people self-identify with a particular racial group, though. right? Again, this is part of that social cultural aspect of it. Race often helps in the forging of group identities and provides a sense of solidarity among people. Race is still central to issues of discrimination and disenfranchisement around the world. People continue to be mistreated due to perceived or self-ascribed racial identity. Genetic evidence suggests that human populations are often more similar than they're different. However, race still does exist as a cultural phenomenon, and it's fundamental to many aspects of human cultural life. So in the context of this exploration of biological anthropology, we take a more nuanced and biologically based consideration of human variation. As such, we trace the variation of a few key traits. We pay particular attention to what these variations may tell us about the evolutionary history of the populations who carry them. Discussing human variation seen in people today, we reconstruct ancestral histories and adaptations. There has been significant population movement via colonization and globalization in recent centuries, and it is difficult at present to track the impact of these recent trends. Instead, we focus on the variants people carry from their ancestral population. Right, so we're going to start talking about different variations, right? We're going to talk about skin color first, altitude, climate, the blood groups, and then we're going to get into lactose intolerance. So skin color. While it is problematic, skin color has historically been used as a trait for distinguishing human races. Firstly, what's problematic with it is that it misrepresents the nature of skin color or variation. So using skin color assumes that skin color variation can be neatly divided into distinct groups of color. In reality, skin color has a clinal distribution. So there is a continuous and progressive gradation of a given trait over a geographic region. In the case of skin color, we see that long-term residents of the tropics have the most pigmentation in the skin, while long-term residents of Arctic locations have the least amount of pigmentation in the skin. The transition from the tropics to northern parts of the globe is very gradual. So if we were to walk across the continents from the equator northward, you would not see sudden changes in skin color from one group to the next. So again, using it as a marker for race grossly misrepresents the nature of skin color. Secondly, using skin color to differentiate races ignores the adaptive significance of skin color variation. So darker skin is more common closer to the equator, and lighter skin more common further from the equator. This is because darker skin color provides greater protection from damaging ultraviolet or UV radiation. When we're exposed to the sun, we're also exposed to the sun's UV rays, which can have harmful consequences for our bodies. Things like cell death during sunburn or prolonged exposure can lead to skin cancer. Darker skin color provides greater protection from damaging ultraviolet radiation or UVR. But the evolution of human skin pigmentation is more complex. It is related not only to the levels of UVR, but also to two unrelated nutrients, vitamin D and folate, that are both key to human biology. Vitamin D is unique in humans because it is the only vitamin that we produce in our skin following exposure to UVR. Vitamin D is important in almost every body system, and its primary function is to influence calcium absorption and storage in our bones, intestines, and kidneys as part of our body systems for regulating calcium levels. Folate is important for cell division, for growth and development, and for reproductive functions like sperm production. Folate and vitamin D have different sensitivities to UVR. While vitamin D is synthesized, it's produced in our skin in response to UVR exposure. Folate is degraded or lost in skin exposed to UVR. The close relationship between these two nutrients, UVR and the degree of skin pigmentation, is the basis for one of the main theories explaining the evolution of human skin color, the vitamin D folate hypothesis. Because UVR depletes the folate stored in our bodies, we require more protection from the sun's destructive UV rays in regions where sun exposure is high throughout the course of the year, such as near the equator. More sun means more protection needed. Over countless generations, populations from these areas have adapted by producing more protective melanin in their skin. However, in areas where sun exposure is limited throughout the year, such as in the temperate and Arctic areas far from the equator, human populations needed to be able to maximize the benefits of their limited sun exposure and maintain the proper levels of vitamin D. So melanin is a pigment in the skin that helps give us our brownish color. So populations that lived in these areas for generations evolved less melanin and lighter skin color to take in as much UV energy as possible when it was available. Our earliest ancestors in Africa would have been covered in body hair that protected them from the sun. As human populations in this equatorial area lost their body hair, they needed to have enough melanin to protect themselves from the harmful effects of the sun while still allowing for vitamin D synthesis. When human populations left Africa and settled in latitudes with less sun exposure, dark skin color was not necessary for protection, and it was more important to possess light skin color to help with vitamin D synthesis. So this resulted in lighter skin color variants in non-equatorial populations. So here we can see regional skin color variation globally. And what we see is that it varies geographically. Darker skin is more common near the equator. Lighter skin is more common away from the equator. So although the map seems to show a distinct color categories, we have to remember that each of the color bands on the map accounts for a range of skin color variants, and they've been grouped together just to simplify the map. But again, skin color varies. So that's skin color. Next, we'll talk about altitude. So the further you live above sea level, the more stress is placed on your body. If you are exposed to colder temperatures, more intense solar radiation, more wind, and often more difficult terrain in these higher altitudes. In addition, oxygen concentrations in the air continuously decrease the further above sea level you go. This can lead to hypoxia. This is a condition where you cannot take in enough oxygen to meet the metabolic needs of your body. In its mildest form, hypoxia can result in dizziness, headaches, and nausea. Prolonged or intense hypoxia at high altitudes has the potential to cause much more serious stress and damage to the heart, the lungs, and the brain. In general, there are two primary ways that humans respond to physiological stress, either acclimatization or adaptation. So acclimatization refers to a short-term temporary adjustment our body will make to suit the current environmental context better. So this is like a suntan, being a short-term acclimatization that builds a layer of protection from UVR exposure. So another example is vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So vasodilation is the expansion of the blood vessels near the surface of our bodies to help heat escape the body's core. Essentially, it happens in hot temperatures. The blood vessels at the surface of our bodies near our skin will expand to allow more blood to flow through. As blood flows through, and having it closer to the skin allows for heat to escape through the skin. And so we are releasing heat. Vasoconstriction is when the blood vessels near the surface of our bodies will constrict to help maintain heat in the body's core. So this occurs in cold temperatures, and it is the opposite. Essentially, the blood vessels near the surface will constrict, you'll get smaller, less blood will go through, you have less less heat being lost, essentially. So all of these acclimatizations are short-term, helping people adjust to their temporary environmental needs and then reverting back to their normal state. So an example is you might experience increased respiration in a high-altitude environment, taking in extra air through deeper, more frequent breathing to get the oxygen that you require. Your lung capacity might increase so you can take in more air with each breath. You might make extra blood cells to facilitate the transportation of oxygen throughout the body. Each of these responses is temporary, and they will set in relatively quickly to help you avoid hypoxia, but they are reversible. The process of acclimatization to high altitude can also help athletes train for major events. Often, athletes who live at low altitudes will train at higher altitudes for a few months or weeks or months before an event. By doing this, the athletes expose their bodies to the extreme altitude and trigger the acclimatization process. When the athletes return to a lower altitude for their events, they will maintain that acclimatization for a short period of time before their bodies revert to their prior states. The athletes will now have more efficient respiration and oxygen distribution during their events, thanks to their acclimatization to their training environments. Similarly, if an athletic event is taking place at high altitudes, athletes will train at high altitudes before the event to gain the acclimatizations they need to avoid hypoxia during the event. In addition to temporary acclimatizations, there are also adaptations. So adaptations are permanent and are the result of natural selection acting on traits over many generations. These are often more extreme than acclimatization. So some examples. Indigenous populations from the Himalayas and the Andes Mountains ranges are our two main examples. So Tibetans have adaptations in their circulatory system that support higher blood flow and oxygen movement than in low altitude populations. Andeans have, Peru, have adaptations that allow them to take in more oxygen when breathing, and they have a higher proportion of red blood cells to facilitate oxygen movement through their bodies. It's believed that these two populations evolved different adaptations to their similar high altitude environments because of differences in their genetic makeup and because of the different lengths in time that they have inhabited their respective regions. The Himalayan populations have had a longer time to adapt to their high altitude environment and may have developed different traits as a result. In addition, the founding populations in these two regions were different and probably carried different genetic variants to their respective locations. The variants presented in the founders of each population would have limited the possible trajectories of natural selection and adaptation in that population. So now we talk about climate. Populations with a long history of living in hot climates have different body proportions than populations with a long history of living in cold climates. So the climate that we live in evolutionarily can have an effect on the body proportions that we have. So Carl Bergman outlined a relationship between overall body size and climate. This is what we call Bergman's rule. Joel Allen identified a relationship between limb proportions and temperature, and this is called Allen's rule. So Bergman's rule and Allen's rule. So Bergman's rule recognizes that as volume increases, surface area increases at a slower rate. And Allen's rule recognizes that an equiax shape, so having approximately equal dimensions in all directions like a cube, has less surface area than an elongated shape of the same volume like a rectangular prism. So going back to Bergman's rule, right? Volume increases, surface area increases at a slower rate. So imagine a cube, and let me give you this here. Imagine a cube that measures 1 unit in all directions. This cube has a volume of 1 cubic unit and a surface area of 6 square units. When we increase the cube to measure 2 units in all directions, we find that this larger cube has a volume of 8 cubic units and a surface area of 24 square units. This means that the volume has increased by 8 times, while the surface area has increased by only 4. Bergman's rule applies this scaling principle to body size. So it argues that larger, thicker body sizes are well adapted for cold climates because they have more volume relative to surface area. Having less surface area translates to less heat loss, so a large body with less surface area helps conserve body heat in cold temperatures. So that's Bergman's rule. So if we go back to Allen's rule, right? Go back really quick. Allen's rule recognizes that an equiax shape having approximately equal dimensions in all directions has less surface area than an elongated shape of the same volume. So like a rectangular prism. So Allen's rule. Here we imagine an equiax cube that measures 2 units in all directions. It has a volume of 8 cubic units and a surface area of 24 square units. Now imagine an elongated shape that measures 4 by 1 by 2, which is this one right here. It also has a volume of 8 cubic units, but it has a surface area of 28 square units. Both shapes have the same volume, but the elongated shape has a larger surface area. Allen's rule applies this principle to limb proportions. It suggests that elongated limbs are well adapted for hot climates because they have greater surface area. The increased amount of the surface area allows for greater body heat venting in hot temperatures. Right? So that's Bergman's rule and Allen's rule. And this is how climate can affect our body shapes, our body adaptations. Next is the ABO blood group. So in order to understand ABO blood group, and we've talked about it previously a little bit, we had to understand antigens. And so antigens in the ABO blood group system are the cell surface markers found on red blood cells that relates to an individual's ABO blood type and triggers antibody reactions to a foreign blood antigen. So the A allele results in an A antigen, B in the B antigen, and the O allele produces neither antigen. One allele is inherited from each parent, giving the offspring one of 6 possible genotypes. Remember, we talked about this. AAAO, BBBO, AB, and OO. These genotypes then correspond to different phenotypes. So, when the distribution of these alleles across indigenous populations worldwide are tracked, we find noteworthy patterns. This is a very, very interesting fact about the ABO blood group. The A allele is found more frequently in Europe, parts of Australia, and some far northern areas of North America. The B allele is more frequent in northern and central Eurasia, and the O allele is very frequent in the Americas and parts of Australia. In fact, some parts of North and South America, almost 100% of the indigenous population has the O allele. So these blood allele distributions can tell us a lot about the evolutionary history of different populations. Areas with high concentrations of one allele may be the result of the founder effect. So if a population has a relatively even distribution of blood antigen alleles, a subgroup of this population moves away to settle a new area and found a new population. If the founding subgroup has a disproportionate number of one alleles, we'll likely see an unusually high frequency of that allele in that descendant population, right? Blood antigen allele distributions may also be the result of gene flow. If there are large geographic areas with similar frequencies of an allele, it may suggest the population in this area were mobile and had a lot of interbreeding. Right? So it's very, very interesting to look at blood groups, especially when we map them out. So I'm going to show you really quick that mapped out. This is the percentage of the population that has the A allele. Right, the A allele is more common, as we see, in parts of Europe, Australia, and then far northern America. Here's the B allele. The B allele is more common in Central Asia. And then the O allele, right? We see here that the O allele is more common in the Americas and parts of Australia. The last part of human variation that we're going to talk about is lactose intolerance. So in some cases, human variation is more the result of a cultural factor than strictly environmental factors. So here we see culture having an effect on the way that humans have evolved and adapted. So an example of that is lactose tolerance in humans. So milk contains a sugar called lactose. To digest this milk, you need a particular enzyme called lactase. All mammalian babies have a gene that codes for lactase, which allows them to produce the enzyme early in life so that they are able to digest their mother's milk in infancy. As mammals grow, we are weaned from our mother's milk, and then the gene for lactase is turned off, and they stop producing the enzyme. Thus, as mature adults, they're no longer able to properly digest lactose. Most adult humans follow this typical mammalian pattern. Their lactase production gene is turned off as they mature and they become less able to digest lactose. Attempting then to consume dairy products containing lactose during adulthood results in a range of digestive discomforts. This is what we call a condition of being lactose intolerant. Lactose intolerance is the norm for our species and other mammals. Most humans worldwide are lactose intolerant as adults. There are exceptions to this rule, though, worldwide. Some populations around the world have unusually low frequencies of lactose intolerance. Their adult populations have what we call high lactose tolerance, where the adults are still producing lactase, making them capable of digesting lactose. The populations with high levels of adult lactose tolerance have primarily descended from Northern European and East African groups. What we see is that these populations have a long history of pastoralism, which is a lifestyle where raising domesticated herd animals is central to the diet and their economy. In some cultures, there is a history of using the animals specifically for their milk products. In these populations, we see higher frequencies of adult lactose tolerance, and these populations in parts of Europe and Africa have been using animal milk products for many, many generations. People who have a genetic variant or a random mutation that allowed for continued lactose digestion into adulthood could then take advantage of the available food source throughout their lives. Over time, this genetic variation was selectively favored, such that descendants of these populations today have higher frequencies of adult lactose tolerance than other populations. What's interesting is that lactose tolerance evolved separately in different parts of the world. In fact, the genetic mutations for this ability were slightly different in each of these regions. When one version of the ability randomly appeared in part of Europe that practiced dairy farming, it was selectively favored in that population. And when a different genetic mutation resulted in the same ability in a population in Africa with dairying traditions, it was selectively favored and maintained in that region. Note then that in both cases, the start of the ability is a random genetic mutation. It is then passed to future generations at a high rate because it is useful in a population that has dairy animals on hand. It is not the result of eating dairy products. Rather, it's a coincidence that a mutation randomly appeared in a population of dairy farmers who could put that trait to use. So understanding this has profound implications for the understanding of our evolutionary history. First, it indicates that the evolutionary history of organisms is influenced by their diet and the adaptations that evolved to suit their dietary needs. And then second, today's distribution of human lactose tolerance exemplifies the complex relationship between human culture and biology throughout our evolutionary history. In this case, humans modified their diet through a cultural shift towards pastoralism and the incorporation of dairy products. This new diet created a new environmental context, which then selectively favored the lactose tolerance trait when it randomly appeared. Through culture, humans have the ability to alter their environment so much that those alterations influence their biological evolution. Right? So the last thing we're going to end with is a chart or a graph looking at the frequencies of lactose intolerance and the different populations. So most humans, again, are lactose intolerant. Lactose tolerance is unusual, and it's seen in populations with a long history of raising animals for their dairy products. So some European African populations. So we can see here, again, this is lactose intolerance. So those who tolerate lactose then are the ones with the lower percentages of lactose tolerance. So you can see Kenyans, the Tutsi, the Swedish, the Swiss, the Finnish, Euro-American, they have low levels of intolerance, whereas the Igbo, Thai, Asian American and Native Australian have higher rates of lactose intolerance. Right, so that wraps up this chapter on human variation. I believe the next chapter will be on primates, so we'll be switching gears for the next half of this semester.